Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a great privilege to be here and a wonderful opportunity. It's also presenting me with some wonderful learning opportunities to listen to the esteemed speakers later on this morning. And I've already learnt something from the whole experience, and that's never to trust a Geordie bearing gifts. When my fellow Northeasterner, the good Professor Alderson, sauntered into my garret in the college some months ago with what turned out to be a stunning archival deposit under his arm, of which more later, he casually mentioned, after I'd enthused about these illustrations that he was leaving us, he said, "Oh, I'm involved in a little magazine," he said, "and we're having a little chat up at Oxford later in the year. Would you care to come and join in?" And this became this wonderful occasion that I'm enjoying at the moment. Not that I should complain. I'd had a wonderful dinner, wonderful company, and especially given that I haven't delivered on my original brief, and I don't make a habit of this, I should say, in the presence of the president of my college. My original brief was to just sketch out the history of surgery over the 100 years of the journal, and I started, and I thought I'd put in a bit of context, and I thought I'd have a little bit of research around the members of the editorial board and so on. I didn't get very far, so my original brief of surgery 1913 to 2013 kind of stopped after the first year. So instead of a story of surgery over a century, what I hope to present is the context of the genesis of the journal, its origins and its founding. The British Journal of Surgery, as you know, was founded in London in 1913 at what I will argue is a key point in the professional development of surgery. Today, I want to have a look at its first editor, the Bristol orthopaedic surgeon William Ernest Hay Groves, before establishing the context and of the wider social, institutional and medical context of the founding. And what was going on in 1913? Now, for historians, it's very difficult dispassionately to study that year because of the shadow of the First World War. It's always very easy to think of it as this sort of innocent, halcyon time of boaters and post-Victorian parasols. But if one looks more closely and trying to move anachronism aside, you see the steely cold evidence of modernity there. In 1913, the first domestic refrigerators went on sale. Niels Bohr published what would become the basis for quantum theory, and Henry Ford set up the first assembly line. And perhaps war wasn't inevitable. In the German states, Kaiser Wilhelm was being celebrated for 25 years of peace. Mussolini, at the time, was running a socialist group in Trieste, and Trotsky was a journalist in Vienna. But that's not to say that there wasn't ferment in the air. Gandhi was rallying Indian miners in Natal. There were brawls between Arabs and Jews in Palestine. And in June of that year, Emily Davison tried to catch the attention of the national media by stepping in front of the King's horse at Epsom, with fatal effect. In that year then, shortly after lunch on the 13th of February 1913, 8 surgeons met in an upstairs room of the Royal College, possibly this one. In the chair sat Sir Berkeley Moynihan, Professor of Clinical Surgery at Leeds, freshly knighted and elected to the Royal College Council. Robert Jones of Liverpool was there, whose fame as an orthopaedic pioneer was beginning to spread, also representing the northern expertise. More local were St George's surgeons Sir William Bennett and Thomas Crisp English, Edward Moss Corner of St Thomas's, Charles Herbert Fagg of Guy's, and William Sampson Handley of the Middlesex. Moynihan may have been in the chair, but it was the final member of this group who was steering. Ernest William Hay Groves of Bristol. With Moynihan's support, Hay Groves moved to set up a new journal. He recommended, as you can see, that it be edited and published in the British Isles, and, characteristically of the period, feature original articles and brief records of rare or obscure cases, And this quote is reproduced in the supplement you have before you. Moynihan was immediately elected the first chair, and Haygroves the first editorial secretary, which was his title for the next 20 years. Corner, English, Fagg and Handley were appointed to the executive subcommittee, who would, I quote, read and select papers for publication. They were joined by two absent but local members, Frederick Francis Burghardt of King's and Darcy Power of Barts. Jones and Bennett, given their commitments elsewhere, were to join the broader editorial committee alongside other stars of the surgical firmament, as you can see here. The 35 members represented 15 cities not only in the British Isles, but also across the empire. And we need to remember that this and the 20 years succeeding were the peak of the British Empire. Orthopedics, as you can see, we've already mentioned, was well represented in the meeting in Handley, Fagg, and especially Jones, and of course in Haygroves himself. After studying medicine at St Bart's, he returned west to practice, eventually as surgeon to the Bristol General Hospital and professor of surgery at Bristol University. And here we see him in 1916 or 17. With the mechanical aptitude he inherited from his engineer father, he developed an interest in orthopedic operations and believed in the fixation of a fracture with a bone peg. The illustration here is from his Modern Methods of Treating Fractures, first edition in 1908, and that published by John Wright of Bristol. And it was Haygroves' connection with Wright that meant that the BJS set up with Wright, and that was the relationship that lasted, of course, for much of the century. And it was these clinical illustrations that the good Professor Alderson sauntered into my office with under his arm. And I have with me colour copies of more of them, but I just wanted to show a few while we're sitting here today to whet your appetite. These were undertaken operations that he'd begun during the war, and these are from operations immediately afterwards, his pioneering work on fixation and on grafting, and these are stunningly represented by the Bristol artist Dulcie Pillars. We can't find out very much about Pillars, unfortunately. Often this is the case that the artists, as invisible technicians, as historians call them, leave very little trace. But we know that she was probably born in and around Gloucestershire in around 1890 or 1892. As I say, this is only a taster of the works that we have, and you're welcome to have a look at the copies afterwards or to come to college. We'll be using them next year in the activities we'll be engaged in to commemorate the outbreak of the First World War, and I'm very pleased to say that we have support from the Knott Trust, from the Newman Foundation, and from Arts Council England for this. Again, for my presidency years, we've raised a lot of external money for this important project next year, and this will culminate in November of 2014 with a conference on military medicine, then and now, called From Hunter to Helmand. And very much will be keen to engage with military surgery and recovering service personnel now as well as then. Haygroves had begun to formulate the idea of a journal due to the, and I quote, the unpleasant fact that every leading country in Europe and America has its journal of surgery, whereas this country, this native land of Hunter and Lister, and we'll come back to that, this native land of Hunter and Lister had nothing more than general periodicals. I rather suspect as a dig at BMJ and Lancet right there. Haygroves was to edit the journal as editorial secretary for 27 years. And I think even Jonathan has a little way to go before reaching that landmark. Relatively junior at the time of his first meeting, he hadn't yet secured his first full appointment. No doubt his close friendship with Moynihan was crucial. It was Moynihan who presented Haygroves with this silver salver after 2 decades of editing, now in our museum collections. And it was Haygroves who then delivered the first Moynihan Memorial Lecture. This salver is about 40 centimeters across, and I don't know how well you can see, but it's got signatures from Moynihan, Power, Wilfred Trotter, George Grey Turner, George Gask, Arthur Burgess, Fagg, and George Makins. Haygrove set out to secure the cooperation of one or more surgeons from every teaching centre in Great Britain. And he continued, so as to avoid the dangers of publication in London, where the rivalry of the great schools often prevents concerted effort. And he was right to be cautious. 3 times a national surgical journal had been attempted in recent memory, and any new journal would have to rival the successful publication operations, especially in Germany and in America. In the United Kingdom, dozens of hospitals and medical societies published their own transactions. It's not that there weren't plenty of medical periodicals around. So here we see the total medical periodicals introduced. This is founding of medical periodicals by decade over the 19th century. So as editorial board member Sir Rickman Godley remarked in the first issue of BJS, he apologised for the surfeit of medical literature. The previous century had seen an unprecedented explosion in specialist periodicals in medicine and other sciences. Before 1800, there'd only been around 50 medical periodicals established, but by the end of the century, there'd been nearly 800. The pace of publication continued to accelerate until the Great War, and according to a list compiled by the then librarian at the Royal College, the BJS was the 1033rd British medical periodical to be established, and it's British encompassing the empire. Not all of them survived, of course. Of all those begun before 1840, so everything to the left of 1840, only one endured, and that, of course, was the Lancet. Among the 13 other journals founded in 1913, so the BJS is one of 13 journals founded from the Transactions of the British Proctological Society to Tuberculosis Yearbook, only BJS is still published. Why then did BJS survive and thrive where dozens, hundreds of others failed? What fueled Haygrove's and his colleagues and his 7 colleagues in that room in 1913? To explain the genesis and success of the periodical we're all here to celebrate, I think we need to appreciate not only the energies of the editors then and now, but also to appreciate the contemporary medical and institutional context for this development. In 1913, surgery, and British surgery in particular, was riding high. The fierce late 19th century debates around antisepsis versus cleanliness had given way to a more general acceptance of the value of an aseptic operating environment, and clinical success and improved mortality rates were by now undeniable. With increasing boldness, techniques were devised for a greater variety of more accurate and increasingly intricate internal procedures. The self-confidence of surgery and surgeons was evident not only in the operating theatre, but also in print. Here we see the proportion of surgical journals published in the New England Journal, and as you can see, this period between the 1860s and the 1920s is the period at which there's the greatest proportion of surgical contributions. I mean, the overall quantity is going up across the century, of course, but it's at its peak. Beyond the printed word, surgeons operated in an increasingly complex institutional landscape. The early years of the 20th century were an especially dynamic period in British healthcare, too often ignored, again, because of the shadow of the First World War. Shortly before the first meeting of BJS, the first benefits were paid out from the 1911 National Insurance Act in Britain, which was often taken as the first step towards the post-Second World War welfare state, and certainly it changed drastically the remunerative structure for many clinicians. The London hospitals, as we've already seen, as powerful as ever, were subject to considerable change, as evidenced, for example, by King's College Hospital's move to new premises in Camberwell in the same year. The Medical Research Committee and Advisory Council for Research, later the Medical Research Council, met for the first time 4 months after the BJS board. So King's Camberwell, the MRC, and BJS are all products of this really important time in the history of medicine and surgery in particular. The professional strength was also reflected in dedicated surgical institutions. Across the Atlantic, of course, the American College of Surgeons' inauguration was addressed, and here I immediately bring it back home, was addressed, the American College may have been founded, but it's addressed by Sir Richmond John Godley, the then president of the Royal College of Surgeons of England, who is, of course, Lister's nephew and founding member of, contributor to the BJS. And I should also add that in the college that he was president of, the Hunterian Museum was still going strong. It was by then precisely a century old, and we've just been celebrating this year our bicentenary. So if you're passing Lincoln's Inn Fields, we have a small exhibition, we have a book, and we've just awarded a Hunterian Bicentenary Fellowship to an anatomist at UCL called Wendy Kirk, who's going to come and dissect some of our pickled monkeys. It's very technical, primatological, but we're really pleased to have this research use of the collections that's 200 years in the making, carrying on today. And we had a nice dinner and some lectures on the 18th of May 2013, the precise bicentenary of the opening of the museum on this site in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Admittedly, in May 1813, it was only members of the college who were admitted, not even the physicians, and then only for 2 afternoons a week, and then only with a guided tour. But we'll celebrate a bicentenary if we can find one. There's been considerable overlap at the outset and beyond in the editorial board and the council. Hay Groves was Hunterian professor the year after the founding of the journal and served as counsel of the Royal College for 24 years and was vice president in 1928-9. And he gave the 1930 Hunterian oration, Hero Worship in Surgery. Here's the council the year before he was vice president. This is now the 1926-7 council, oil by Musa Ayub, that's hanging on the ground floor of the college. And 5 of the original editorial committee are pictured. William Sanson Handley, William Sampson Handley, Sir Berkeley, later Lord Moynihan, seated in the centre as president. That's Hay Groves beside him, Sir John Lynn Thomas, and Sir Darcy Power sitting there in characteristic pose before him. So the BJS and the RCS, there's important overlaps and resonances that has continued to this day in the person of Derek. Note also the very careful attention to the heritage of British surgery. On the walls there, the Reynolds portrait of John Hunter featuring prominently in this council portrait, as it has in every one since. This attention to heritage is also evident in the new journal, with portraits of Lister and Hunter in its early issues. We can look back with justifiable pride, trumpeted Godley in the first issue, to our great English surgeons of the past. His uncle, Lister, graced the first frontispiece. Lister, the doyen of British surgery, the first to be elevated to the House of Lords for contributions to medical practice, figurehead for a generation of revolution in clinical practice, and in whose name British surgeons staked professional recognition and autonomy. Lister was followed in successive editions by the other members of the British surgical trinity, John Hunter and Astley Paston Cooper. This reflected a wider movement in medical circles to celebrate and commemorate the profession's own history, as reflected in the increasing role of heritage in medical museums, which previous and since then had been much more focused on research and teaching. They're having this heritage function as well. And in addition to this, you get the founding of journals dedicated to the history of medicine. Again, the Germans leading the way with the Archiv für Geschichte der Medizin, established in 1907. So we're seeing in 1913 not only the roots of the journal and the establishment of the professional autonomy of your profession, but also of mine. History of medicine can trace its roots to around this time. Briefly to conclude then, the Chicago physician J.H. Salisbury remarked in 1906, and I'll quote because I like it, "The medical school is attended as a rule but once in a lifetime. The meetings of the medical society are usually infrequent, but the medical journal, like the newspaper, is an ever-present friend whose influence and advice are potent for good or for evil. A salutary lesson then for the editorial board. One might argue that a journal is as important a tool as any other in the surgeon's armamentarium. I hope to have shown in this very brief discussion this morning that the timing of the founding of this particular ever-present friend was no accident. The early 20th century was a key moment in the professional identity of surgery, and British surgery in particular, not only thanks to technical developments in the wake of asepsis, but also because of the post-Lister institutional developments, of which BJS was one. A specialist journal serves not only as a medium of communication between members of a professional group, it also demarcates the group's boundaries and establishes, or in this case cements, its professional identity. The contribution of surgery to British life and welfare would be strikingly demonstrated in the years that immediately followed the establishment of the journal. And the journal nearly discontinued publication as the war broke out, but decided it would be very useful for publishing examples of military trauma cases, and they were right. Surgeons, as you know, served in the Royal Army Medical Corps during the First War, including all those of serviceable age on the editorial board, and made many technical advances that would set the scene for the following century, as so vividly demonstrated in the pages of this august journal. Thank you very much.